Good evening, and welcome to What's Your Story? My guest tonight is Lisa Zarcone. She describes herself as a survivor of child abuse prompted by mental illness. Lisa was raised by a parent with severe mental issues. Do you have someone suffering from a mental illness in your family? If your answer is yes, you know the hellish nightmare that can be. Her story is also one of survival and healing. She has graciously agreed to share her story with you. Welcome to the show, Lisa.
Thank you, James. How are you doing tonight?
I'm very well. I'm glad you're here tonight. We should say at the outset that this is a two-part interview. The first part of this interview, we're going to deal with your personal testimony, and in the second part, we're going to deal with the rest of your story, okay?
Sounds wonderful.
Okay.
All right.
Each part is a half an hour.
Okay.
Lisa, would you please tell our audience about your background?
My background, I am a wife, a mother of three, grandmother of three, and it's amazing to have grandchildren. We are raising two of our grandchildren at this time, so I had to step away from the workforce for a bit to take on this role because my youngest grandchild, my grandson Liam, is autistic. So I've taken a step back to, help raise them and learn, how to help him the best that we can. So it's been an interesting journey. But I am also an author, an advocate, and a caregiver. I've always, worked with disabled adults, disabled children. I also worked in a facility for young women, mentoring them. It was a locked facility, and these young women have been in trouble, and I did a lot of journal writing with them and peer counseling. So I call myself the constant juggler. I switch my hats continually.
So you're one of the thousands, tens of thousands of grandparents raising grandchildren.
Absolutely. I see it every day when I bring the kids to school. It's become more and more common. So.
And how did you, if you don't mind sharing, how did you end up in that position?
Well, my oldest son, him and his girlfriend at that time were young when they had my granddaughter. So they needed support and help. So my husband and I, wholeheartedly jumped in to do what we needed to do.
Absolutely, yeah.
But unfortunately with my grandson, it was a little bit of a different scenario. His mom, not my daughter, my son's, it was a different young woman that he was with. She had mental illness, and she could not care for Liam properly, and Liam needed so much because of his, his disability. So again, my husband and I stepped up and took on the role as parent-grandparent. So we are just jumping right back in again and doing it all over. And it's wonderful. I mean, it's hard, it's tiring, but it's wonderful. It really is.
There's no more important job in the world.
No, this is true because, raising children and teaching them, great, wonderful qualities and values, it's so important, so important. So yes.
Lisa, would you tell our viewing audience about your parents, your mom, your dad?
My mom and dad, John and Joanne Siga. My parents were the typical 1950s young couple when they met. So West Haven, Connecticut, that's where, they grew up and where I grew up as well. And Savin Rock was a huge thing back then, if everyone knows Savin Rock, entertainment, the amusement park. So that's where they met, they dated, they learned how to smoke cigarettes together because back in the day, that's what it was all about, smoking cigarettes.
Yeah, you would light one for yourself and one for the lady.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely,
so
Boy, were we idiots.
Yeah, that's what I say all the time. Why are you smoking? But anyways, they met, they fell in love, they dated for many years, and then they got married. And, my brother came along, and then I came along. Okay.
Why don't you tell us about your siblings, please, if you will?
Yes. When my brother was born first, he passed away at the age of 9. I'm sorry, I stop a moment when I think about that because, it was a very difficult time for us. But it was my brother and I, just the two of us, and we were very, very well connected and very tight and, best friends. And, losing him was very difficult for me. I was 6 years old when he passed away. So when I think back to our memories together, I honestly think about him. He was always a jokester, and he would make me laugh all the time. So it was like his way of, keeping me distracted from other things that were happening in the home. He was really great at it. And when I lost him, I was lost, for sure.
What was the difference in your ages?
2.5 years.
2.5 years.
Yeah, 2.5 years.
And what did he pass away from?
He had leukemia. And he struggled with it for about 2 years. And actually, at the end of his lifetime, what really did take his life was the chickenpox. His immune system was really low because of the chemo and the radiation, and he got the chickenpox, and that is ultimately what, took his life.
And how old were you when your brother passed?
6 years old.
You were 6.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Wow.
And
you still remember that?
Oh, I remember so much. It's amazing. But we had a very close relationship. So, his passing was really devastating.
Isn't his passing an anniversary just passed of his passing?
Yes, it's amazing we're doing this week because it was 46 years yesterday, April 22nd, 1972, he passed away. So 46 years later, here I am sitting here talking about it. So
wow.
It's
Do you
amazing.
still feel his presence around you?
All the time. All the time. I always feel his presence. I feel like he's my guardian angel. He's really gotten me through so many hard times. And I do. I feel him every day. And I was talking to him yesterday. I'm like, give me a sign. I want to know you're around. And he always does. He just always gives me something. I always feel that. So it's a wonderful thing.
Lisa, where'd you go to high school?
Oh, I went to West Haven High School.
West Haven?
Right in West Haven, yes, the Blue Devils.
The Blue Devils, yeah, you did.
Football,
How was high school like, Lisa?
High school?
Yes.
High school was challenging, I have to say, because I was going through so many of my own personal things, and I was really trying to find myself at that time. So high school was challenging, but in my mind, I started doing this transition to where it was, what do I really want to do with my life? Do I want to stay stuck in this mess, or do I want to change it? And I really my thought process started to really change. So high school, by junior year, I really was so committed to doing wonderful things, and I excelled in art, so my art classes were like my favorite place to be.
Really?
In the art room. Oh, absolutely, yes. So art, and I took business. Everyone back then took business, stenography, typing, all that lovely stuff that nobody talks about.
Nobody does anymore. Yeah,
I'm dating myself right now.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so high school was definitely a huge transition for me, but I had a mindset, and I was going to make big things happen, and I was determined.
Now, Lisa, the program tonight is about your experiences growing up with a parent who had a severe mental disorder.
Yes.
At what age did you come to understand, and it was your mother?
Yes.
And at what age did you come to understand that maybe something was a little wrong?
That's funny because I was young. I have to say maybe 4. At 4 or 5, I really noticed that my mom was very different from the other moms. In the neighborhood, there was a ton of kids and tons of parents outside. But my mom always was a very different type of person. And I actually used to study her because some of her behaviors were just so odd and bizarre. Even as a young child, I was very inquisitive, and I was like, why is she doing that? What is happening? And then I would refer to my brother, and I'd be like, what's going on? And his way of getting around it was back to the joking. He would make me laugh. He would do silly things. Let's go outside and play, and detour me from that. So he was also very aware of my mom's behaviors.
What types of behaviors would she exhibit, and what type of mental illness did your mom suffer from?
Oh, well, first of all, my mom suffered from bipolar. She was manic depressive, but she also had what they call schizoaffective disorder. Mm-hmm. So you have tendencies of a schizophrenic, but you're truly not. But she would change personalities, and that's what the connection is. And she also had mania, so she would do the highs and lows. So my mom had a lot going on all at one time, and she would either be high as a kite or low as can be. And some of the first memories of my mom, which is sad to think, was her sitting on the couch, smoking her cigarettes, crying, talking to herself, listening to music, oblivious to everything around her. And, you'd go in and talk to her, and she wouldn't even answer half the time. She would be in her own world. And as a young child, you want your parent to be strong and caring, and not that she didn't love us or care about us, she just was so lost. And it was unfortunate, but those are my first memories of my mom.
Now, in our interviews before we started taping, you said that your abuse from your mother was prompted by her mental disorder.
Yes.
Okay, is that a fair statement to say?
It's a very fair statement to say, yes.
Okay.
You know, I always knew my mom loved us. You know, my mom always wanted a family. She loved us tremendously. She had a heart of gold. But her illness just really took over. And once it took over, you know, we lost my mom in the process of that. You know, every once in a while you'd get a little glimmer, but pretty much, you know, she was in her own bizarre world most of the time. And I say that, yes, my abuse comes from that because it was not only emotional, mental, and then it became physical. So, you know, it was nothing for my mother to take something and whack us with it, me especially, and my brother, not really, but after my brother's passing, it, you know, the violence came into play. And it was scary and it was traumatizing. So yes, on all levels, you know, her mental illness definitely caused a lot of dysfunction in the home.
Well, Lisa, how does a 6-year-old deal with that? How do you process that? And how did you do what you did?
I was lost myself for a very long time. I was always confused. I was always scared. I was always trying to figure things out. And you know, I really wandered around lost for years, and we had very little outside help, and I didn't know what else to do but just to try to get through each day and try to figure out what was the best course of action for that day, what is going to get me through. I used to go outside a lot. Nature was a huge release for me. Loved nature. I'd be outside with the animals and, you know, the trees and all that stuff was very comforting to me. And I did a lot of artwork, you know, from a young age, you know, started with coloring and drawing, and I did a lot of that, and as I got older, I started writing. So I was finding ways to self-soothe, to you know, help myself, and it was very difficult.
So as you were growing up, these periods that your mother would fall into, would they last a week, 2 weeks, a month, or?
It really depended. You know, she never was completely stable. So let me say that. So she was always having an issue. But sometimes she would drop into these deep depressions, and they would last for weeks. And then she would many times go to the hospital for short stints, you know, and get regulated and come back out, and we would move forward. And, you know, it was just never stable, and it was always uncomfortable, and you always walked on eggshells. You never knew what was happening next. And my mom would switch like on the drop of a dime. One minute you would have depressed Joanne, and then next minute you would have high as a kite Joanne, where she would be, you know, dancing and singing. And you know, I even talk about this in my book, and it's still very disturbing when I think back to it. My mom would dance, and she would urinate on the floor, and she would dance in her own urine, and not even think about it. It was not, you know, what she was thinking about in that moment. She was high and feeling her moment in life, and that's all that she cared about in that moment in time. And that's sad when I think back to that, you know, that was, you know, who she was at that time.
Now, were there state agencies or anything that intervened? I mean, you went to school.
Yes.
There was an incident at school with your mother, was there not?
There was an incident in junior high school.
Would you tell our audience about that, please?
I will, but before I do that, I would like to just take one step back.
Sure.
Because when you talk about like agencies and help,
yes,
therapy was done in the home. And you know, they would come into the house and do group therapy. So not only would my mom talk about her issues and problems, but there would be like 5 or 6 other people that would come as well. So as a young girl, I would be sitting here listening to not only my mom's stories, but everyone else's stories.
Yeah.
And the end of that, they would hand out bottles of pills. And this was tranquilizers. And they would hand out everyone's pills, and they would sign and leave.
Now, they being who? The state or?
This would be a social worker that would come to the house, a therapist, and she would run the group and hand out the medication. Very bizarre. But it was the 70s, so I guess, you know, maybe they're just trying to figure out what worked best for people at that time, but it just was not normal. It definitely wasn't normal to me as a young child. I was probably about 8, 9 years old at that time. And I thought it was quite odd that people would come in and there would be a lot of crying and talking and awful stories, and I would be sitting and listening. You know, definitely not where a child should be.
Absolutely, yes.
But yes, fast forward to junior high school, and boy, this is a rough story. And, I'm walking down the hallway, and of course, junior high school, you don't want to be noticed for things that are out of the ordinary. You want to be accepted, And I'm coming down the hallway, and all I hear is my mom's voice screaming my name. Lisa, where are you? Screaming. I come around the corner, and here is my mother standing there in the atrium. She's wearing a nightgown. It's see-through. She has nothing else on underneath. My mom was not a thin woman at that time. Not that that matters. She's still wearing a see-through nightgown. And she's screaming my name, and she's ranting and raving. She was off her medication at that time, so she was really struggling. But can you imagine being a 13-year-old teen walking around the corner to see your mom doing this? And the principal comes out and talks to her and escorts her out. I'm, on the other hand, running down the hall and out the back door of the school, and I'm mortified and I'm traumatized by this, and I can't believe this is, what my mom was doing. And they escorted her out and sent her home. And that was the extent of it. That there was no follow-up. Nobody called me into the office to see if I was okay, what was happening in my home. It was never even addressed. All they wanted to do was get her out and send her home. And they let her drive. That's the best one. Send her back out in the car, go. And she was so completely out of her mind. And that when I think back to that, that's very upsetting, because first of all, that's my mom, and it's hurtful to think of her in that way. And second of all, that nobody was willing to step up and ask the questions. And that's what I call the era of silence. That time of life was like nobody talked about anything. What happened in the home stayed in the home, and there was no help. And that's a shame. And today there's many children still out there that are living in these awful situations, and nobody is speaking up. And that's definitely a tragedy.
No. It makes me wonder, Lisa, as I listen to your story, did you feel abandoned by your relatives who didn't step up and help out?
I did.
Would you share that with us, please?
Yes. As a young kid, I always felt like, my family was going to reach out and do something. But then as I got a little bit older and nothing was happening, and I was pretty smart, and I was like, geez, why are they not helping? Why are they not stepping in? I not only felt abandoned, I felt like, and I describe this, I felt like garbage on the bottom of someone's shoe, because I wasn't worth saving. And that's how I felt. It's like I'm living this horrible existence every day, and I'm trying to get through each day, and there's all this different abuse, and nobody's helping. And when you think about your own family, those are the first people you would think that would step in. And they truly did not. We were there for a very long time. And the only reason we left the home was because my mother tried to kill herself. And they had to take me out. And I went to live with my grandparents. And then my mom came to live there too. So we went from one home of abuse, and it turned into a whole nother, era of abuse, because my mom was still very much out of control. But the offering of help was very limited, and that's a shame.
Lisa, how did you sleep at night? I mean, you get to a point, I imagine, where you can look at your mother's actions and say it's going to be a rough day today, because Mom is really out of it today.
Yes, it's amazing. I could just hear in the tone of my mother's voice.
Yes.
I would know immediately which Joanne I was getting.
Really?
And then in the drop of a dime, it was changing. So I always lived with instability, with the unknown, and I had to try to keep up the pace. And to keep up the pace of mania is impossible. I mean, because she would switch. And there were nights that I was terrified to go to bed, because my mom would actually come into my room sometimes, and she would have scissors or a knife, and she would just be standing over me. And I would talk to her. I'd be like, Mom, what are you doing? What's going on? And she wouldn't even answer me. And she would stand there with cold black eyes, with this whatever utensil she had in her hand, and then sometimes she would just walk away. And that was eerie. So many nights were sleepless nights. A lot of fear, a lot of fear.
Anger?
As I got older. As a child, it wasn't about anger. It was just wanting to be okay, just wanting to be safe. But as a teen, very angry, very angry. It took me a long time to get over that anger, because I could say my mom turned violent. And one of the worst violent episodes, she beat me up with a meat tenderizer, a wooden meat tenderizer, and those jagged edges. And I remember coming into the house, and it was like 90 degrees, and my mom had the heat blazing. And I came in, and all I did was turn the heat down, and she went ballistic on me. And at that time, I think I was about 12. And she beat me up with this meat tenderizer, and I had marks on my back for probably a month. That was awful. But that's one of the many things that did happen.
And your brother was gone by this point?
By that point, yes.
Yes. So you really felt abandoned by the person you loved and who protected you, because, as your book points out, your brother found ways to get you focused on other things.
Yes, and I did feel abandoned by my brother, and I used to talk to him and cry.
Yes.
You know, by myself. I never let anyone see me cry, and that was a whole other thing.
Yes.
Is that I felt so beaten down, and I didn't want to show weakness, so I would cry on my own time. I would find somewhere to be privately, and I would talk to him, and I would cry, because I was like, where are you? You know, where are you? But I always felt like he was there in a sense, but sometimes I would get very angry because I felt very alone.
Well, where was your dad in all this?
My dad, you know, after my brother died, and my dad said this, the day my brother died was the day my mother died with him. And this is a true statement. We lost my mother when he passed away. She just could not come back from it. So my dad engrossed himself in his work, and he was always out, and I think he was running. You know, he was devastated himself. He really loved my mother and really loved our family, and I think when he lost both of them, he just couldn't deal with it, and he submerged himself in everything he could not to be home. And eventually, he just didn't come home. And they got separated and then divorced. And at that time, I think I was 12, 13 years old.
You talk about being sexually abused.
Yes.
Was that you think the result of your mother's illness, or how did that play in?
Definitely has to do with my mom's illness, because she did not make good choices in regards to who she would bring into our home. My mother would bring anybody and everybody into our home. Our home was always chaotic and crazy. She would pick up, you know, homeless people off the street and bring them home. Mm-hmm. And I had other encounters in my home that something could have terribly gone wrong, but my mom kind of intervened, and by a homeless man that she had picked up, and he was at our house. But what happened with the sexual abuse part was, there was a young man who was in our neighborhood, and he was gone for a long time and came back. And then he came to our house, and he was sitting on the step with my mother, realizing the situation. I'm a young girl. She's very sick. I can take advantage of this whole scene. And that's exactly what he did. And he told my mother that he had leukemia. He was dying like my brother. And of course, my mother, right off the bat, was like, oh, you have to come into the house, you need to be here, and blah, 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 all this. So they formed a common bond, but he was a very sinister young man, and he told me right off the bat that I was going to be his girlfriend, we were going to be together, and that was the end of that. And I was about 13 at that time as well. And I was like, no, this is not happening. And
how old was he? He
was 16, mm-hmm. And he took over, and he beat me down, I have to tell you. I was already not, I don't want to say not right. I was already really confused because I was living such an awful lifestyle.
Sure.
And he came in and he beat me down even further. He broke me down, and it started out physical, and then it turned sexual. But it wasn't just the sex, it was torture. He enjoyed torture. He enjoyed torturing me. He enjoyed doing awful, awful things that I do talk about in my book.
Yes.
And it is pretty horrific. And he was definitely, you know, torturistic. And I do believe he definitely had mental illness as well, because I would watch him and my mother feed off each other. Their energy together would just go through the roof. And unfortunately, I was the prey. And it went on for almost 2 years before I got out of it.
Did you ask God, where are you?
Many times. I used to pray every single night. I prayed constantly.
Yes.
Please let change happen. Please get me out of this situation. And I always had this glimmer of hope in my mind that it would change. And I never gave up on that. And I think that's another thing that saw me through all that was my faith. I did have deep faith, even from a young age. You know, we grew up in the church. We went to church. We were Catholic. We did all that. But I just had a deep inner faith that always was close to my heart. And I think that is part of what got me through. Definitely.
Wow. Well, Lisa, the first 30 minutes of this interview has flown by.
It has.
And I'm sure my audience has been riveted listening to your story. And we have part 2 of this interview that we're going to tape today as well. So that's all the time we have for tonight's show, part 1 of this. My thanks to my guest, Lisa Zarcone, for sharing her story. Everybody has a story. What's yours? Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, good night.